Welcome to another episode of the Decision Clinic podcast with me, Paul Gordon, your host, exploring the journey of decision making. And I'm excited today as I look at my notes. I can see I'm joined by Princess Delany. I can't help but say, are you a princess? Or is that your name that your parents gave you because you were their princess?
Kind of both. Princess is a family name. So in my family, I think there's like 6 princesses and 4 princes. So there's a lot of us that have the same name.
My goodness, so it's great to have you with us. And you know, it really helps me to understand a little bit about what has you come to the clinic today. You know, what had you walk through the door? And perhaps give me a little bit about yourself so I can understand your decision world that you operate in.
Okay, so in my world, I'm 18 and I'm a very first year uni student. I'm a UNICEF Australia Young Ambassador, and I feel like in the spheres I've found myself in because I'm studying politics and international relations, and I love grassroots community interactions. I think I've come to find myself in a world where I'm surrounded by young people who have so many great ideas of things they want to fix and change in the world that we see, but we're faced with like barriers of like bureaucracy or not being heard from people that are in positions to make those decisions. So I think from what I'm learning at university about like political systems versus what I'm seeing from young people about their actual interactions with the systems in place, there are so many gaps wherein people are falling through the gap. Ideas are going unheard, untapped into, and there's so much potential wherein young people can actually start making an impact now rather than waiting for the future when they're like leaders with big jobs and whatnot.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot there. Well, firstly, where are you studying? Because I'm always fascinated to know, and I know that people listen to this podcast want to know the picture of who you are. So yeah, where are you studying? You're doing international politics and...
international relations and political science. I'm studying at the Australian National University in Canberra.
Ah, great. Okay. So are you from Canberra? Have you spent much time in Canberra? You're just learning the Canberra way, are you?
Yes, I've just moved. I'm from Sydney, and I moved purely to do politics.
And I guess ANU is the place to do that, right?
100%.
So, well, and I love hearing your experience of the world of ideas falling through the cracks, and for young people who've got a passion and a commitment to having an impact, and then, well, what do we do with that? How does that play out? And you know, often we see people come together because there's a common interest or a common aim. And so sometimes when we look at the world, we see everyone's trying to do this same thing because, of course, what we see is people gathering around us. Is that how your life goes?
100%. I think something really interesting is so often we see the same people doing the same things. Like when I go to uni and there's like different societies, international relations stuff, where there's people championing social movements, it's always the same faces. And then it's like we're all bandwagoning on the same idea of something that we want to change. And I think that's unique because there's so many different abstract ideas that people have that might not have the same platform of supporters to make it a bigger issue that people are actually responding to. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Weird, because on campus there's so many of like, for example, socialist alternative people that you see at those events, but then there's Labour people who you see at other events. So it's like you're seeing the same groups of people that have very strong beliefs about ways that things should be ran, but then we all have such differing ideas, but at the crux of it we all want the same thing, where it's like we want better support for uni students with rent and better subject support. So it's like we all have such similar ideas but such different ways of going around that to some extent it's like we're all kind of fighting the same battle but just on different fronts.
Oh, yeah, and I can hear that. And what's interesting, if I just put a decision-making lens on it, that's kind of what I do, is there's a distinction between the outcomes. You're shooting for the same outcomes, right?
Yeah.
And in decision-making world, we call those the criteria or benefit or the reasons why we do something. So we're all like committed to these same things. But then the ways we go about that, what I call options in decision making, can look very different for different people. Some people might use lobbying as a vehicle to get a particular outcome. Some people might use activism. Some people might use leading a project. And so I think it's interesting to hear, and I guess the university is a really good example of a very diverse melting pot of people that are there to study a broad range of subjects, and then they coalesce on other common interests that they have. But as you say, maybe different ways of going about it and saying, right, here's my approach to trying to address this problem. Does the kind of different people having different ways of thinking they're going to turn out the problem, does that create more strength for the outcome, or does that create fragmentation? How do you see that?
I think it creates fragmentation, because if we all band together and we have the same way, like there's more manpower if we all have the same mechanism of coming towards it. But it's a duality wherein having so many different groups with different mechanisms is great, because then it's like catching different people that might have one agreement with one group that's doing something but disagree with another group's method. So
Right.
it's interesting wherein it's having so many groups has the most target audience wherein more people are reached, but then it's less effective because they're so fragmented in the means of how they're going about actions. Like some groups prefer protests on campus or giving out flyers, wherein other groups actually make student organizations and have means and bureaucracies wherein they're running actual student bodies to make sure decisions are made that are actively helping people. So there's different ways of that activism or proper systems in place. It's different looking at how different groups are actually targeting goals. And I think that's the best part of uni, because then it's every single person based on how much you want to be invested in something. Like I'm a person where I am not going out handing out flyers because I can't do that. I'd rather sit in a room and have those debates and then write down actual policies and what's happening with that. Whereas other people might be more involved in going to protests and actually like putting out flyers. So I think it's very interesting being in that space wherein different groups are targeting the different people and what they're interested in doing in their sense of activism on campus.
It's interesting when I look at it through how it causes decisions. What are the decisions we're trying to maybe influence or impact or create, right? One of the outcomes might be a decision called better conditions for students, right? Someone's going to make a decision that might mean they invest some money or apply some resources to do something, reduce rents or whatever it might be, right? There's a decision somewhere that we're trying to cause, and now we're looking at, well, what does it take to have that decision play out? You know, what I just heard you say, which is fascinating, and I'm not surprised just hearing you speak that you'd be someone who'd be very strong in a conversation, reasoning through a set of arguments and saying, here's a set of rationale that should impact that decision. And other people's, that's not their strength at all, but their strength might be to gather a crowd together and to generate some energy and have people come on the journey, and that might be handing out flyers and having a bit of a protest for the same outcome, the same decision that we want to influence. And so I'm always interested in looking at what's the decision that we want to effect, and then what is effective at causing that decision to be made in the way that we want the outcome. A lot of the work I do with my clients is trying to differentiate between getting a decision made and selecting the best outcome from that decision versus trying to force the decision to go a certain way. Because often the world of activism is we've decided what the decision should be, and now we're pushing to have the decision made to be the thing that we want. And what I see is one of the most effective things to do is to step back from that for a moment and say, okay, what is the decision? Let's say the decision is, how do we have best conditions for students? Just picking a random example. Then best conditions for students, some groups might say, the thing that matters to me, best conditions is cheaper rent. I want to push for cheaper rent. The right decision is cheaper rent. Whereas actually, if we engage in the decision and say, well, let's look at what some of those different things could be, and cheaper rent might just be one of the ways in which we could improve, let's say, well-being for students. And if we start to look at those different ways of turning out the outcome called better conditions for students, we can engage more in the conversation about which is the right way to go, rather than come forward with, here is the right way to go. And so it's an interesting tension between the passion for the outcome, better conditions for students, and then the commitment to, I've got to get that outcome through this means, and the way I get this means is support my campaign for lower rents for students. So it's an interesting way of how I hear you speak and looking at what that looks like. I'm also interested, so here's another question for you, is the different mechanisms you speak to probably engage different stakeholders in different ways. So if you think of obvious stakeholders for student wellbeing are current students, but there's probably a whole range of other stakeholders that are impacted by a decision on what maybe a university does to change conditions for students. And I'm interested in your experience of how different types of people engage in different types of approaches.
Okay. Well, keep in mind, I've only just started uni, so I'm not 100% sure of how that works. But in what I've come to observe is I've sat in on a few student body representative meetings, and the people who are the ones writing the policy and having like constitutions that they're bound to, those people then are able to actually impact the ANU and make decisions that our university to an extent is expected to uphold, because we're paying, as students, we pay, I think it's $180 that we pay to the university to make sure that our student body, our student union, ensure that they're taking our ideas and putting them into what the university does. So that might be through providing us with student legal aid or student food and things like that. I think it's interesting how our student body is actually speaking directly to the ANU, whereas our groups and like our societies that are having grassroots movements on campus are then speaking to the wider student body. Because I've already always been involved in politics, from being in Sydney. A lot of my friends who weren't involved in politics from the beginning, they see like a society protesting on campus and they grab a flyer and it's, wow, these are our ideas. And then from there on, from interacting at that protest, then they might be like, hey, I'm going to go to a student body meeting, or I'm going to go read this constitution or this policy that's been put out. So I think what happens is the grassroots movements either push a person to join that movement or then to join a policy. So I think it's a great way to like start with those societies that are educating, that are putting out things very rapidly, because I think an issue that does come with a elected body that's bound to the bureaucracy of their constitution is that then they have such a slow response time to things that actually happen. As in the society, all you do is pay like your $5 member fee, and then you can be involved. If you're passionate, you can write out articles, journals. So it's very much based on the pace of which you want to see things happen, and then based on how you personally fit in within that rhetoric. If you are a person that's rather to write down lots of articles, go out and protest, or if you're a person to sit in a meeting and bring out your ideas with that. So yeah, it's based on how quick you want things to happen.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. And often this challenge of the pace of the world moving, the pace of decisions that need to be made, and the pace of action that we can take don't often match up. And policy is one of those things that can, especially if we talk policy with a big P, such as legislation, the rate at which it moves necessarily in terms of good governance, but the rate at which it's moved can be so slow compared to the rate at which the change that's needed to impact an outcome. And I can see that's where other approaches that kind of coming in from the sidelines saying we've got to short circuit this, because otherwise by the time the policy decisions have been made, the policy is enacted, so much has happened that we could have avoided, for example. Time relationship and people's commitment to the quick action, and therefore how they might join a body or join a protest, is a interesting way of thinking what motivates them in their contribution to a decision. You just said something there on the way through that I'm fascinated to understand, and of course I'll ask it like a decision. So at some point in your life, it sounds like you say you've been in politics for most of your life, right? So at some point there was a decision that you made that said, here's something I want to be part of. Do you know when that was? How did that happen?
So I participated in Youth Parliament last year. Youth Parliament is apolitical, so there's no ties to any parties. But during that process, I was in Year 12 studying legal studies. And again, I'd learned so much theory about what happens in our system, but actually being involved in the process of writing bills, researching who they impact. I was in the Aboriginal Affairs Committee last year, and we did so much research based on land education and how there's such a big lack of that in schools. And I think being in that room, listening to the stories of First Nations people and how they felt marginalized within the educational system, I think that kind of projected me to try to be in a space wherein I can make policy to make change, because we see so many amazing lobby groups and many charities that have all this work, but in reality they're not our governing bodies. So I think coming out of Youth Parliament and seeing all the different committees and the bills that like young people were writing, it made me feel like I want to be in spaces wherein I can vote and be able to write policy and write ideas to make it happen in our system. So I think going on from that, a few months after Youth Parliament, I joined a party, and from joining that party, I had a passion, like campaigning for elections, being able to go out and speak to community members, understanding what their perspectives are on situations, and being able to collate that into then what I'm studying at university. It's so interesting because I personally would never work in politics. That's like my personal hell. But being able to study it and understand what happens and what motivates people to do certain things, I think I would love to be in spaces wherein I can influence the legislation that's made in order to actually respond to our different societal needs. Because I think a big thing that happens in politics and in the legislation that's made, it's such a blanket solution to oftentimes things that are happening. And from Youth Parliament, we see that there's so many gaps within equity wherein people might need extra support. Like I was talking with a few people yesterday wherein we were discussing that sometimes financial support from like Centrelink, it'll help a parent cover financial expenses, but then that parent still has to work an extra job to be able to take care of their kids. And then the gap there is, while the parent's at work, who's able to take care of the kids and give them that family guideline. So it's like, yes, we're able to provide blanket solutions through our legislation and whatnot, but there's so many gaps wherein I think joining politics and hearing so many different community experiences has helped me to understand those gaps and potentially find and look for a career wherein I can help fill those gaps and make sure that where our legislation isn't meeting the needs of our people, we can then use our political knowledge and our understanding of the system to make sure people are being met where they are and having their needs catered to.
So impressed by that as a vision for you and the impact that you can have. And just using your example of Centrelink, it's interesting to see the decisions about the interventions that we can make or the support that we can provide and whether it has the impact in the place that actually needs the impact. And it's often a challenge that I talk a lot about decision making, the making sure we're not just taking account of the financial outcomes but the non-financial outcomes. And often things like grants and aid and so on ends up with a very strong financial lens. Someone can input money, charities, not-for-profits can provide money as an input, we can use that money, and the money looks like it's the thing, whereas really the thing is the freedom to have your working life, the freedom to have your children well supported. It's the thing we actually care about is that thing.
Yeah.
The vehicle we have to impact it, as you say, can be a bit of a blanket and sometimes doesn't work in the right way. And part of the challenge, also the human condition, is we might think, oh, we're doing great. Yeah, there's plenty of money going in that direction. That's all good, without necessarily understanding the outcomes it's really having and looking there, as you say, for the gaps that what would make the real difference to that particular situation, where you could say there's widely agreed an acknowledgement of the gap, the support that's needed, yet what do we do about that is often the bit where there's some different thinking that can be applied, and then, of course, different decisions to be made as to what that support can look like. But yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at where is the impact we want to have and how do we have that impact in the right way.
Yeah.
I want to challenge you then, because you said working politics is your idea of hell. Clearly, you're politically active in some respects, and politics is a vehicle, yet working in politics would be a bad thing. So why is that? I'm intrigued.
I just don't like the bureaucracy that comes with being in politics. I feel like I am such a dynamic person wherein I'm fragmented in what I feel and how I think, and I don't think I could be tied to like party lines or like ideas like that. And I think being in parliament, I'm also a really emotional person, and I think listening to different things happening in the community or having to make a strictly political policy-based decision on things might be a bit hard for me personally. And yeah, I just don't think I can do it. I'm not made for politics. I think maybe an NGO, community work, something like that could be for me, just not straight up politics, no.
Yeah, and one of the things I always enjoy in the clinic is seeing people's self-awareness, how they make decisions and what drives them, and noting your commentary around how emotional you are, and you wouldn't want to have that frustration of being up against the bureaucracy by being fixed into the political system. That's great to see that you have that visibility, right? Your way of influencing those decisions might be through an NGO versus a political approach, and someone else's way of influencing them might be donating to the charity they like to donate to, or going and joining the protest. It never ceases to fascinate me when I look at stakeholders and their commitment to influencing decisions and all the different ways that can look. And I think from on my side of the table as a decision professional, it serves me to keep remembering that, because it's easy for me to look at, here's the way we make decisions, here's how people get involved, that's the answer. And actually what it takes is to keep being in conversation. Well, what I can see your commitment, what's going to serve you with the things that work for you and the strengths that you have and so on. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience in youth parliament. This sounds like an amazing journey, a thing to be part of.
Youth parliament was I think it kind of put me on the bandwagon and like the role that I'm on right now. Like I think youth parliament set me up for uni, it set me up for my work with UNICEF, it set me up with everything I do right now. And I think what's great about UNICEF is it brings such a wide variety of people together. Like I'm such a Western Sydney girly, like I know what happens in my space, and then coming to youth parliament and like making friends from the North Shore, meeting people from like out in the country, it's so interesting looking at how the different socioeconomic backgrounds of people impacts the way they think, impacts the way they see policy. Like I'm not a First Nations person, and going into the Aboriginal Affairs Committee, I was very much there to listen and learn, because I felt like in the spheres I'd been in, I hadn't interacted with many First Nations people. And being in that space, it was coming to understand how there's gaps wherein people feel as though our educational system doesn't target their needs. In the space I had been in, I was taught First Nations education throughout primary school in studies of religion, legal study, like every subject I did, there was a unit on First Nations history and whatnot. But then hearing from actual First Nations people about how they felt as though it was to an extent maybe performative, the way in which we were taught about it, wherein the actual First Nations people who want to learn about their country and their language weren't being given that opportunity. I think it was so interesting being in that sphere and learning about how education about First Nations culture and history was so differing in the way it's received by a non-First Nation student versus a First Nation student. So I think that was so critical to the way I saw things, because it was coming to understand that my somewhat sheltered raising and growing up was so different to people that had been, for example, interacting with like the justice system or like interacting with social services. And from that youth parliament, apart from the First Nations committee that I was in, seeing people in Women's Affairs Committee where my friends were, it was looking at how our system, whilst we were trying to respond to like domestic violence rates, there was so much that wasn't happening that even young people could see that there needed to be reforms made. So being in youth parliament, actually writing a bill, like 90 pages of a bill, of researching and looking into that, it brings you a perspective where so many issues that are seen to be adult issues and things that wouldn't per se impact young people actually does impact young people, and young people have solutions that we are thinking about that can actually be implemented. For example, the Education Committee last year came up with a mechanism for an alternative suspension means wherein children that were having bad behavior in school wouldn't be suspended. I'm not 100% sure on it because I wasn't in the committee, but it was targeting that to make sure those students weren't left behind and that there may be neurodivergent tendencies were being responded to. So it's very interesting looking at how solutions that our people, like our politicians, might not be thinking about actually have means of helping people. And the YMCA has actually put in a form of that alternative suspension mechanism wherein it's helping young people who might be young offenders. So it's great to see how ideas that have come up in youth parliament can actually be implemented to make change. And I think that's so beautiful, because young people, we are the future, and frankly we are the now as well. So we're able to make decisions right now that are going to impact the future that we're going to live in. So yeah, youth parliament's great. I loved it.
Oh, that's really exciting to hear your experience and to hear things have actually rippled through. And I think your commentary around how do we engage young people in bringing ideas forward, what's the environment that we can create that is productive, allows for different ideas to come forward. I keep coming back to, I guess, what I said earlier, that we can all agree on the outcomes. We can all agree on actually just taking people out of school that need education probably isn't the best answer for actually our commitment to their future. And as you say, we, the old folk, might not have a view as to what could work, whereas, of course, you would definitely have a view, and the young people will have many things that they could bring to the table from their own personal as lived experiences that might not match up to what we think. But it's interesting to see that as a way of looking at it, is to say, what does it take to encourage the thinking and have the thinking have a voice, and then play out through the decisions when a school is looking at a policy on suspension or whatever. How do they make that decision, and where can they get some new ideas from that can play out? I'm fascinated to hear and understand more about youth parliament, and as you say, your experience of having to write a 90-page bill. When I think back to when I was 17, which I guess you were 17 when you were in the youth parliament, I couldn't imagine anyone getting me to write 90 pages of anything. So there's a high level of commitment that had you and your other colleagues at youth parliament really jump in. And I do love hearing about the visibility of the issue from a different perspective. And that's another challenge in the world, is how do we have those perspectives come forward and validate those perspectives, because it's very tempting and easy to kind of go, yeah, but that person doesn't really understand or know.
Yeah.
And then we lose the richness of the different perspectives that allows us to at least grapple with the whole spectrum of issues, rather than just, again, back to my earlier comment, well, if we just throw a bit of money at this thing, that'll solve the problem. You mentioned UNICEF, so to say a little bit more about that and your role with respect to UNICEF and how that came about.
Okay, that's like my favorite thing right now.
Oh, great.
So I'm UNICEF 2025-2026 Young Ambassador in Australia, and I think there's a team of, I'm going to say 12, I might be wrong with that number, but there's a team of us across all states and territories in Australia. Our role is to interact with young people, understand meeting young people where they are. So currently what we're doing is running local conferences of youth, and their short name is LCOYs. And in those LCOYs, it's taking young people and understanding their concerns about like climate, and understanding how they feel responses to climate from our governments, from their schools, are impacting them, and what can be done in order to respond to these concerns. Because if we're looking at it from a realistic perspective, climate change as young people is at the forefront of everything we do, because we are seeing the ramifications of climate change every single day. Like, we're seeing such rapid differences in weather. There's so much severity in the concerns and crises that we're seeing. So being in UNICEF, something that I love about it is being able to interact with young people from spaces that I will never be in. Like,
Right.
I'm in a space where in the things that I like are so politics driven, whereas another young person I might deal with and interact with at an LCOY is a sporty person, someone that cares about like pop and music and things like that. It's so interesting, and it's an opportunity for us to learn. So at an LCOY I was at recently, I spoke to a young person, and they was talking to me about endangered frogs around their area and how their community had put together a relocation drive for young people to be able to relocate the frogs and allow them to thrive in different spaces. So I think it's really important that groups like UNICEF are being able to speak with so many different young people from so many different walks of life. And separate from UNICEF, something I've noticed in community work I had done before is so often it's the same type of young person coming, and someone that's so driven in activism, like someone like me. And something so beautiful about UNICEF is that it's young people who might not be that one brand of young person. It's differences of young people. Like at the LCOY that I was at, the same one as the kid with the frogs relocating, a kid told me that he had found out about the LCOY from one of his friends at soccer. And it's like, yay, that is so amazing, because we are seeing different forms of young people with different concerns, different contexts come in, because at the crux of UNICEF is making sure that every child in need is having the best form of well-being, making sure their mental health, their concerns with climate and social justice are responded to. So I think being with UNICEF, it has very much quenched my desire to want to know what's happening with young people, to want to know how to respond to it, because within every single situation and circumstance, no matter how similar it seems, different young people have different perspectives on how they can be responded to make sure they're feeling at their best. And it's so beautiful being part of UNICEF and actually hearing those things firsthand, because I don't like hearing things from other people. Like, I can't stand that, because you're telling me what you think based off what you've seen. I like being able to interact one-on-one, and I think that is so beautiful about what UNICEF does in ensuring that children well-being is responded to. And apart from that, being able to act as a policy advisor and like creating reports, researching, understanding what young people want, and actually collating that. Because I think what often happens with young people is that there's so many bodies that are speaking to young people, but something UNICEF does that I admire is actually collating that evidence and information and providing it as, hey, this is a policy report that we have written and come up with that we're going to share based on what we found and what can be done to reform decisions that are being made to potentially improve the life satisfaction of young people. And I think that's fantastic.
It's great to see how lit up you are by it. And one of the things I noticed, you've said this a few times in our conversation, about the energy you've been getting from engaging with people that you would not normally engage with from different areas, different regions, different backgrounds. And it's always warming for me to hear that, because I talk a lot about how diversity is so important in decision making, yet our natural lives don't tend to lead us in that direction. We tend to live in the same communities, we tend to hang out with the same people at school, etc. And so to find places such as UNICEF, such as Youth Parliament, where you are thrown into the mix with all these different people and your willingness to engage and hear and understand their perspectives is very encouraging. I'm always thinking, how do we support bringing different stakeholders into decision processes? And it sounds like the ELCOI work for UNICEF is a way of, a bit like you say, bringing things together in one place so that it's not being bombarded with different information from different people. And the role that UNICEF can play is that together and making sure it's consistently viewed, but not dumb it down to a kind of, you only get one piece of the point, one piece of the issue. You get the spectrum, but in a way that means you can engage with it that's meaningful. I think it's super encouraging. Congratulations on your commitment to UNICEF as well and being an ambassador. That sounds like a great opportunity to bring your passion to something that is going to make a big difference. One of the things that many people come into our clinic with is with a decision that they might be facing for themselves. And I've had people come with decisions for their business, decisions for their children, decisions for their families, decisions for their holidays. Is there a decision that you're in the middle of, that you're facing, that we can have a quick conversation around, that maybe I can give you a little bit of a diagnosis on?
Yeah, actually. I think a decision that I'm trying to face is how to actually have people respond to the work that young people do. Like, young people are starting so many grassroots organizations and bodies to really bring to light the situations and the issues that we find important. And something I would like a decision made on is how to actually have stakeholders and people that are making decisions in these places meet us at the table and listen to what we're saying, to actually take it and implement it. So, yeah.
Great. We can unpack that a little bit. And the first thing I talk about when we have a decision that someone's dealing with is to try and really get clear on the decision.
Yes.
So if the decision is, what's the best way to have young people's issues, young people's perspectives part of bigger decision making?
Yes.
If that's the decision, the next question I'd say is, well, who are the stakeholders in that decision? So obviously the young people are the stakeholders, and I guess the policymakers are the stakeholders. Who else might be stakeholders in that kind of a decision?
I think community members, like people apart from young people, because so much of the fervor that comes from young people is the people that support them, like their churches, their social groups. And so, yeah, I think community members, maybe people that are like providing fundraising for their organizations, people that are donating.
So if we think about those people, in fact, all the conversation we've had today, think about how might they get engaged in the decision on how to have more perspective brought to the table. And just thinking aloud a little bit, first thing I'd be saying is, okay, if we think about, let's say, the policymakers as a key stakeholder, and they're the ones that we want to bring new perspectives to the policy process, how do we think those stakeholders, the policymakers, would want to be engaged in a conversation about how to bring in more perspective? And one of the ways we can look at that sometimes is, what are existing mechanisms that we can use? And it is tricky. And doing a lot of work in the federal government, I know that the sort of policy process is a little bit on rails and it's a little bit closed in some respects. So even being willing to say, how do we open that up to new approaches and new input and perspectives, which is what I guess what we're talking about here. Have you got any thoughts on that? If I was to say, how could you get some input from those stakeholders on how they'd like to get this perspectives, how would you do that?
Honestly, I don't know. Because in my brain, it's like politicians and people that are making policy already have so much. And if we're being realistic, they don't often have the time to come down and sit in on meetings and hear what's actually happening on the ground. So I'm honestly not sure, and I feel like that's where I'm stuck in finding a means to actually get responses from the people that are making the policies. Something I love about UNICEF is because it's such a respected organization, so much of the work that is done is actually responded to. But then when it comes to other grassroots like things that young people are doing, I think it's quite difficult getting a response and actually being understood.
Oh, that's an interesting challenge. So a place you could look, just thinking about the channels to communicate with those people. Like you said earlier, when you talked about the child heard about the ELCOI through their football club, many of these policymakers, decision makers, operate in other communities for other reasons because of their own commitments, let's say, to their children's success. So maybe there's some channels that could be used. And I'm saying this carefully because it could look a bit like an ambush, right? It could look like, oh yes, the people who care about the youth issues turn up at the soccer club for the politician and wait for the politician to drop their kid off and then they pounce on them. I'm not saying that, but those are places that we can look, because if we think about what do those stakeholders care about, that's a place to come back to. If we think those policymakers, what do they care about? Obviously, there's certain things they care about in their role in making policy, but their lives are much bigger than that. And there are other things that they care about, and engaging with them in other ways, such as their children's schools or their children's sports clubs or whatever, that's a place to create a conversation from the perspective of something that they care about. And it's a little bit generic, I'm afraid, but the thinking from who are they? Firstly, who are these people? If we could impact one decision, let's boil it right down. If we could impact one decision that we can see as coming out, one policy decision, by bringing new youth perspectives to that decision, who is that specifically that's involved in that? Oh, it might be a minister, it might be associate minister, it might be some public servants. We can work out who those people are. Then the question is, what do they specifically care about? And understanding what they care about then provides us an insight into how to have a message that resonates with them and a way of delivering that message. And we know there are formal channels, and as you say, the challenge often with the formal channels is they're overloaded, the young people's views get deprioritized. So find the channels to communicate with those people in a way that resonates with what matters to them. This is the sort of bit of a dance that we have in especially very emotive issues. Our passion is for our commitment into whatever that decision, and it can look from the other side of, yeah, that's just about you. Whereas it isn't, right? We know that what has us passionate about is because we care about that particular disadvantaged group or whatever. But it looks a lot like, it's just about you. Whereas if the conversation can come from, you're the policymaker, what matters to you, we want to have a conversation about what matters to you, then that can often be a door for opening new perspectives up. So that's a way I would start to think about that. One of the great things about younger people is you're not constrained by, we've always done it this way. That's part of the challenge of the world. Well, we've always done it this way. The way we do this is you do this survey or whatever, and you have great ideas of new ways of engaging, communicating, and so on. And, we only have to look at social media. I'd say probably one of the most influential social media channels now is TikTok. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for those channels that are now having different levels of impact that they might not have had in the past. At its heart, and I'm saying this for everyone who's listening as well, is the start from who are those stakeholders to influence, but what do they care about? And try and meet them where they care about what they care about, which once you can build that dialogue, then of course you can bring to the table the issues that are really going on. Somebody told me once that the biggest mistake we make is thinking human beings behave rationally. Let's just park that for a second, but if we believe that fundamentally this piece of policy is to actually solve an issue that we care about, let's say it's to solve an issue of child support, then if people are genuinely committed to that, there is a way of bringing new perspectives to that table. And sometimes it's just working not against, but around or in new ways with the machine that's a little bit stuck in its ways, I guess. Well, thank you. We're just at the time before my next appointment, so I'm going to have to wrap up now. But just before I finish, I do want to ask you one final question. So what would you say is the best decision you've ever made?
Oh, whoa. Oh, this has nothing to do with what we spoke about today, but the
That's-
car
that's-
that I bought.
Yeah.
When I got my driver's license, I bought a little Ford, and I thought I wouldn't like it. But after making that decision, it's my favorite thing ever. I love my little car. And yeah, it's just my favorite decision.
Oh, I love it. And that's great, right? Because what you point to is you made the decision and now you're really happy with the decision you made. And the biggest thing in all of this conversation I have in all of my guests here is ultimately the game of decision making is to make decisions that we're really happy to live with. And often that's not the case. Often we get to a point and then we look back and go, why? And in fact, the cause of a lot of upset in the world is regret or dissatisfaction with the decision. So it's a perfect example. The fact you're so happy with it means it was obviously an excellent decision. Thank you so much for being on this and for joining me in the Decision Clinic today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and there's so much in there that our listeners will be able to take away for themselves. So thank you. Have a great day.